In the summer of 1891, a man who had built the most prosperous cattle operation in the Cypress Hills owned everything worth owning and felt nothing at all. Fletcher Crane stood at the edge of his back porch, coffee going cold in his hand, watching the morning light spread across land that stretched further than any one man deserved. The grass was long and pale gold. The creek that curved through the lower pasture caught the sun and threw it back. His foreman, a quiet Métis man named Joseph Beaumont, was already moving the horses from the overnight paddock to the south field, his silhouette small and unhurried against the sky. Fletcher watched him and felt the particular emptiness that came from having no reason to move quickly. 51 years old. 22 years running Sable Creek Ranch. 8 years since Margaret had died of a fever that took her between one Tuesday and the next, fast and without mercy. 8 years of getting up and doing the work and going to bed and doing it again. Not because the days meant anything, but because the cattle needed feeding and the men needed paying, and the land didn't care whether its owner was alive inside or just present. He threw the coffee into the dirt and went back inside. It was Joseph who found her. She was sitting on the fence rail at the north gate, the one that faced the road from Medicine Hat, and she'd been there since before sunrise. No horse, no wagon. A canvas bag on the ground beside her feet and a bruise along her jaw that she hadn't tried to cover. Joseph came to find Fletcher at the breakfast table. "Woman at the north gate," he said. Fletcher didn't look up from the ledger. "Send her on." She walked from the Dunmore Road, alone, no shoes worth mentioning. Fletcher looked up then. He made the walk to the north gate slowly, hands in his pockets, half expecting her to be gone by the time he arrived. She wasn't. She sat on the top rail with her ankles crossed, watching him come, and she didn't look away when he met her eyes. That was the first thing he noticed. Most people looked away. She was young. Not as young as she first appeared, maybe 28 or 29, with the kind of face that had seen enough to make it older than her years. Her hair was dark and coming loose from its braid. The dress was clean but threadbare at the elbows. "Fletcher Crane," he said, stopping at the fence. She didn't extend her hand. "Ivy Sutcliffe," he waited. "I heard you might need a cook," she said, "or someone to manage a house." "I can do either. I'm good with accounts if you need that too." "Where'd you hear that?" "General store in Walsh." "Man there said the Sable Creek cook quit in April and you hadn't replaced him. That man talks too much." Fletcher looked at the bruise. She saw him looking and didn't react. Didn't try to explain it. That was the second thing he noticed. "Who are you running from?" Something shifted in her expression too fast to read. "I'm not running anywhere. I walked here and I sat down and I'm asking for work." "That's not what I asked." She was quiet for a long moment. The morning wind moved through the fence grass. Somewhere behind the barn, one of the horses called out and was answered. "The kind of trouble I came from," she said finally, "is behind me. I'm asking you to take me at my word on that." Fletcher studied her. 20 years of hiring men, reading the difference between someone who was dangerous and someone who was just desperate, gave him a particular kind of instinct. This woman was not dangerous. "You'll have the cook's cabin, meals 3 times daily, main house clean by end of week, laundry Mondays, garden if you can coax anything out of this ground, wages after a month's trial if you're still here." He paused. "You steal from me, I'll know. You caused trouble with my men, you're gone. You want to talk about where you came from or where you're headed, I'm not going to ask again." "Understood?" "Understood," Ivy said. She climbed down from the fence and picked up her bag and followed him. The cook's cabin sat behind the main house, between the woodshed and the kitchen garden that had gone mostly to weeds since April. It was small and plainly furnished. A narrow iron bed, a pot-belly stove, a table with one chair. She stood in the doorway and looked at it the way people look at something they didn't dare hope for. Joseph showed her where the stores were kept, where the well was, how the temperamental kitchen stove needed the damper adjusted in cold mornings. Ivy listened without interrupting. She asked 2 precise questions about supply quantities and wrote the answers down in a small notebook she produced from her bag. Dinner that first night was salt pork and biscuits, and a pot of bean soup that had no right to be as good as it was, given what she'd had to work with. Fletcher ate it in silence and then looked at the empty bowl for a moment. "Where'd you learn to cook?" "My aunt ran a boarding house in Moose Jaw. I helped her from the time I was 12. "Your aunt still in Moose Jaw?" "She passed 3 years ago." He nodded and pushed back from the table. "Breakfast at first light. I know," Ivy said. He stopped in the doorway. She was already stacking the dishes, her back to him, moving with the particular efficiency of someone who'd cleaned up after other people her whole life. "The bruise," he said. She went still. "I won't ask about it. But if there's someone going to come here looking for trouble, I need to know." A long pause. "There's no one coming." Fletcher accepted that and went to bed. He lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought that he probably should have sent her away. He thought about it for a while, and then stopped thinking about it because the truth was simple and not very flattering. When he'd walked up to that fence and looked at her face, he'd seen something he recognized. The particular flatness in a person's eyes that comes from learning not to expect anything. He saw it in his own mirror most mornings, and he hadn't been able to send her away. He wasn't sure what that meant. He decided it didn't have to mean anything. The first weeks made their own rhythm. Ivy rose before dawn. By the time Fletcher came out of his room, there was coffee and food and the table was set. She cooked for whoever came in from the range at midday, and whatever hands were close enough to make it back by evening. She cleaned the main house room by room, uncovering layers of neglect that Fletcher hadn't entirely noticed accumulating. She replanted the kitchen garden, turning soil in the evenings when the worst of the heat had passed, kneeling in the dirt with a focus that looked almost devotional. The men treated her with careful respect. Joseph had said something to them. Fletcher suspected, though he didn't ask what. She and Fletcher ate their meals together because he'd told her that first night he didn't run a servant's house, and neither of them had found reason to change the arrangement. They talked sometimes, about the weather, about the supplies needed from town, about the particular stubbornness of the north fence line, about nothing important. But the talking was real, and Fletcher noticed after a week that he had begun looking forward to it in a way he hadn't looked forward to anything in quite a long time. He didn't examine that too closely. It was the second week when he cut himself on a rusted bolt checking a wagon axle. He wrapped it in his handkerchief and came inside, and Ivy looked at it and said, "That needs cleaning properly," in the same tone she used when she told him the damper was open too wide. "It's fine. It's going to swell by morning if you don't let me look at it." He sat down. She cleaned the wound with the competence of someone who'd done it before, her hands steady and impersonal, and then wrapped it in clean cloth from the kitchen drawer. "You've done this before," he said. "My aunt's boarders were not always careful men." He watched her tie off the bandage. Her wrists were thin. There were old marks on them that weren't quite scars, the kind left by rope or wire, but she pulled her sleeves down before he could look longer and he let it go. "Thank you," he said. "Keep it dry for 2 days." She went back to the stove. That night Fletcher sat on the back porch for a long time, long past dark, listening to the night sounds of the ranch. The horses shifting in the paddock, a coyote somewhere far off across the flats, the quiet that wasn't really quiet once you'd been still long enough to hear it. He thought about the marks on her wrists. He thought about the bruise that was fading now to yellow and green. He thought about the way she'd said there's no one coming with the exact tone of someone who was still deciding whether that was true. He didn't sleep well. The month turned. Ivy stayed. Fletcher told her the wages stood, and she nodded once and went back to kneeling in the garden. A particular evening in late August, she was washing dishes and he was sitting with his accounts at the table, and he said, without quite planning to, "Tell me something true about yourself." She kept washing. "Why?" "Because you've been here a month, and I know you take your coffee without sugar, and you talk to the tomato plants when you think no one's listening." That's not enough to know about a person. She was quiet long enough that he thought she wouldn't answer. "I was married," she said. Fletcher set down his pen. "His name was Garrett Sutcliffe. I met him when I was 22, in Lethbridge. He had money and manners, and a way of making you feel like the most interesting person in the room." She paused. "Those things lasted about as long as you'd expect." She set a plate in the drying rack. The kitchen clock ticked. It started as words, the kind that don't leave marks. Then it became things, doors, glasses, whatever was near when his temper came up. Then it became me. She didn't look at him. I left twice before I left for good. The first time he found me at my cousin's in Swift Current and brought me home. The second time I made it all the way to Calgary before he wired ahead to his brother, who met me at the station and told me my husband was worried about me and that I should come home and think clearly. Fletcher's hands were flat on the table. "The third time I left, I didn't stop moving until I was here." She rinsed the last dish and dried her hands on the cloth. "That's the truth you asked for." He stood up and crossed to the window and stood there looking out at the dark yard for a long time. "He'll come looking?" he said finally. "I don't know. He has pride more than love. It might be the pride that drives him." Fletcher turned. "If he comes here, he doesn't set foot past my gate." Ivy looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You don't have to do that. I know. We barely know each other. I know that too." She looked down at the cloth in her hands. The kitchen lamp made the room gold and warm. Outside, the wind had come up, carrying the smell of rain from somewhere to the west. "Thank you," she said quietly. He went to bed and lay there listening to the rain start on the roof, and thought that he had meant every word of it, which was the first time in a long time that he'd meant something without having to work to find it. Fletcher was sick for the first time in 20 years that September. It came on fast, a fever that hit him between one evening and the next, and had him flat in bed by morning. He didn't tell anyone. He just didn't come out of his room. Ivy found him at noon when she brought his lunch and got no answer. She pushed the door open. He was on the bed, face pale and damp, his breathing wrong. "How long?" she said. "Since last night." "It's nothing. It's a fever." "How high?" "I don't know." She pressed her hand to his forehead the way you did with children, and her expression went carefully neutral, which meant it was worse than he thought. She went and got cold water and clean cloths and came back and sat in the chair beside his bed without being invited. "You don't need to." He started. "I know," she said, and began. She stayed through the night. When the fever climbed and made him restless, and talking to people who weren't there, she took his hand and spoke quietly and steadily until the words reached him through wherever he'd gone. She changed the cloths. She made him drink water. She sat in the chair beside his bed in the small hours when the fever finally broke and his breathing steadied, and she let herself close her eyes. Joseph found her asleep there in the morning, and backed out very quietly and told the men the boss was under the weather. Fever took 3 days to fully pass. By the second day, Fletcher was arguing about getting up, and Ivy was standing in his doorway with her arms crossed, and the expression she used when she wasn't going to discuss something further. "You had an infected wound on your hand that you didn't tell me about," she said. "It healed. It healed badly. The fever came from that. You need to rest." "I have a ranch to run." "Joseph has been running it for 8 years. He can manage another day." Fletcher looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them moved. "1 more day," he said. 2. 1.5. Something almost like a smile moved across her face and was gone. Fine. She brought him meals. She sat with him in the evenings and read aloud from the shelf of books in his study, while he pretended to merely listen and clearly didn't want her to stop. On the 4th day she came in to find him dressed and standing at the window. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Human again." "Dizziness? Arm?" He held it out. She unwrapped it, looked at the wound, rewrapped it. Her hands were efficient and close, and he was aware of the distance between them in the small room, and the fact that it was smaller than it had been a month ago. "Lydia," he said. She looked up. He said, "Ivy," like he was correcting himself, which he was in a way he couldn't fully account for. "What?" "Nothing. Thank you. For the nights." She folded the extra bandaging with her eyes down. "You would have done the same." "I don't know that. I do." She left him there, and he stood at the window for a long time after, watching the fall light lie long across the south field. The letter arrived in October. Ivy found it at the bottom of the mail Joseph brought back from town, addressed in a handwriting she recognized immediately, her own name written in Garrett Sutcliffe's careful, controlled script. She stood in the yard holding it for a long moment. She brought it to Fletcher without opening it. He read it and said nothing for a count of 10. Then he folded it and set it on the table. "He's in Medicine Hat," he said. "I know. He says he wants to speak with you." He looked at her. "Alone." Ivy sat down at the table. Her hands were flat on the wood. "He won't come here to talk." "He'll come here to take me back. He won't." "You don't know him." "No, but he doesn't know me either." Fletcher leaned forward. "I want to send this to a lawyer I know in Calgary, Tom Beaumont's nephew. He handles cases like this, women trying to get free of marriages that should never have happened. He can help you make this legal, make you free in a way that he can't challenge." Ivy was quiet for a long time. Outside the kitchen window, the first snow of the year was beginning to fall, small and tentative, melting before it hit the ground. "Why are you doing this?" she said. Fletcher was quiet for a moment. "Because when I was sick and didn't know where I was, I remember you were there. I remember the sound of your voice." He looked at his hands. "And because this house was already dead when you arrived, and you've been bringing it back to life, and I don't want to lose that. I don't want to lose." He stopped. "You shouldn't have to keep running. You should be able to stop somewhere. This isn't my somewhere. It could be." The words sat between them. Ivy looked at him for a long time with those eyes that never gave away more than she chose. Then she said, "Send the letter." He did. Garrett Sutcliffe arrived on a Tuesday, which was laundry day, which meant Ivy was in the yard when she saw the rider come up the long road from the gate. She'd been expecting it. Something in her had been expecting it since the day she sat on that fence rail and decided to stop. She stood in the yard and waited. He looked exactly the same. That was the thing about men like Garrett. They didn't carry their damage on the outside. He was still handsome, still well-dressed even after the ride, still wearing the particular expression of patient reasonableness that had fooled her and everyone around her for years. He dismounted and said her name. "Garrett," she said. "You look well." He smiled, and she remembered being young enough to think that smile meant something good. "I've been looking for you. I know. I think we should talk." He glanced at the house, at the yard, at the evidence of her life here. Alone. There's nothing to say alone that can't be said here. His expression shifted slightly, just enough for someone who knew him to read it.
Ivy, you're being dramatic. We're married. You have responsibilities. You can't just— I have a lawyer, she said, in Calgary. The papers have already been filed.
The smile went somewhere cold. On what grounds?
Cruelty, she said it plainly. There's documentation. The doctor in Lethbridge.
The one in Swift Current who treated my wrist after the first time I tried to leave. There's more than you think. He took a step toward her.
She didn't step back. You would humiliate me publicly. I would tell the truth publicly. That's your choice to call humiliation.
The sound of footsteps on the porch. Fletcher came out and stood at the top of the steps. Joseph appeared at the corner of the barn with two of the hands, not moving, just present.
Nobody said anything. The tableau held.
Garrett looked at Fletcher. Something calculated moved through his eyes.
You've involved yourself in a private matter. It stopped being private the moment you followed her here.
Fletcher came down the steps unhurried. You'll ride back to Medicine Hat tonight.
And you'll hear from the lawyer before the month is out. What happens after that is between you and the courts. This is— I know what it is.
Fletcher's voice was quiet and entirely level. And I know what you are. Men who hit women in private are very careful to seem reasonable in public.
You seem very reasonable right now. He stopped a few feet from Garrett. It won't help you. Garrett looked at Ivy one last time. Something in him seemed to be weighing options, calculating, and then he put his hat back on. You'll regret this, he said. I won't, Ivy said. He rode out.
Ivy stood in the yard and watched the road until there was nothing to see, and then kept watching it for a while longer. Fletcher didn't speak. He just stood close enough that she could feel the steadiness of him beside her. When she finally turned around, her eyes were dry.
Thank you.
You didn't need me for that.
No, but it helped having you there. He nodded once. He might contest the divorce.
He might, Fletcher said, but Tom's nephew is very good, and I've known the circuit judge for 15 years. He looked at her. You're not going to lose this. She looked at him then, really looked at him, the way she hadn't let herself look since she arrived. This man who'd hired her for no good reason and asked almost nothing of her, and stood on his own porch to face her husband down, like it was the most obvious thing in the world.
Who are you? She said quietly. To do all this for a woman you barely know. He was quiet for a moment. Someone who recognizes what it costs to keep going, he said.
And someone who's been alone long enough to know what it's worth when you're not. The winter that came was hard and fast and beautiful in the way that prairie winters could be, brutal and clarifying.
Snow buried the fence posts by December. The cattle clustered in the low ravine where the wind broke.
The men worked in shifts to keep the water from freezing in the troughs. Fletcher was gone for long stretches, out on the range with Joseph, sleeping in the line cabin on the northwest boundary when the weather turned too bad to ride back. Ivy kept the main house running. She kept food warm for whoever came in half frozen, kept the fires burning, kept track of the stores and tallied what they'd need when the supply road opened again. On the third night of a storm that locked them all inside, she stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the white darkness and thought about the fact that she wasn't afraid. That was the thing she noticed. The absence of a thing she'd carried so long she'd forgotten what it was like not to have it. She wasn't waiting for footsteps behind her. She wasn't calculating exits. She wasn't sleeping light and waking at sounds. She was just standing at a window in a storm, warm and tired from a day's honest work, and the fear was simply gone.
Fletcher came back on the fourth day, half-ice himself, and she made him stand by the fire and drink 2 cups of tea before she let him speak.
Stubborn man, she said, unwrapping his frozen scarf. It's my ranch, he said.
I don't need permission to check my own cattle. You nearly froze. I've nearly frozen before. That isn't reassuring. She handed him the tea. Drink.
He drank, watching her over the rim of the cup with that particular quiet attention of his.
What? She said. Nothing. He looked down at the tea. It's good to come back to a lit window. She understood what he meant. She chose not to say so and went back to the stove.
The divorce papers came through in February. Tom Beaumont's nephew sent word by courier, a formal letter and a smaller note in plain language that said the petition had been granted on grounds of documented cruelty, that Garrett Sutcliffe had made a token protest and then withdrawn it, and that Ivy Sutcliffe was as of the 15th of that month a free woman. Ivy read the letter at the kitchen table twice. Then she folded it carefully and sat for a while. Fletcher came in from the yard and saw her face and stopped. Good news or bad, he said. Free, she said. The word came out strange, like a word in a language she was still learning.
I'm free.
He sat down across from her. Neither of them said anything for a while. What happens now? She asked. Fletcher looked at his hands. He had a way of going very still when he was choosing his words, a stillness she'd come to read as meaning that he was about to say something real.
That depends on you, he said. Meaning? Meaning I'd like you to stay. Not as a cook, not as hired help. He looked up. I'm not good at this. I haven't said anything like this to anyone in 8 years, and I'm aware I'm doing it badly. But I'd like you to stay, Ivy. I'd like to find out what this becomes if we give it time. She looked at him.
This man, 51 years old, with gray in his hair and calluses on his hands, and the particular sadness of someone who'd been good at being alone for too long, who'd given her shelter and wages and legal help and hadn't asked for a single thing in return. I'm not the person I was before Garrett, she said.
I need you to know that. I don't trust quickly. I don't open easily. There are things he broke that I don't know if they'll mend properly.
I'm not asking for what was broken, Fletcher said. I'm asking for what's here. She was quiet for a long moment. The kitchen was warm.
Snow still lay deep outside, but the light through the window had the quality of late winter, a degree warmer, a degree longer.
Spring coming, not yet but coming. Ask me properly, she said. He blinked. If you want me to stay, she said, ask me properly, not practically, not carefully.
Just ask.
Fletcher looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face settled, like a man finally putting down something he'd been carrying at arm's length for miles. Ivy, he said.
Stay, please. Stay here with me and let's find out who we are when we stop being so careful. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. All right, she said. I'll stay. Spring did come as it always did, slow and undeniable green working up through the snow cover by degrees. Ivy's garden came back.
The cattle moved out to the summer range. The men's moods lifted along with the temperature, and the days stretched out long and golden at the edges. Ivy and Fletcher moved around each other differently now. Not urgently, not dramatically. That wasn't the way of either of them. But closer, with less careful distance. He started coming to the kitchen in the evenings not to work at the table, but simply to sit near her while she finished the day's tasks, and she stopped pretending she didn't notice. One evening she looked up from her mending and caught him watching her. What? She said. I was thinking, he said, that this house doesn't sound the same as it used to. What does it sound like now? He thought about it.
Like something's living in it.
The summer brought a harvest and a visiting circuit preacher, and a particular evening in August when the sky went colors that had no right to exist, and Ivy stood on the back porch watching them, and Fletcher came to beside her, and they were both quiet for a long time.
I want to ask you something, he said.
She waited. I know we said we'd find out what this becomes. I know I said no pressure and no rushing.
He paused.
But I'm 51 years old, and I've been careful and slow and patient with everything my whole life, and I'm finding that I don't want to be careful about this anymore. I want to know if you'll marry me, if you want that. I want to know if you think you could.
Ivy looked at the sky.
At the light going amber and rose over the western pasture, at the land that had been someone else's 8 months ago and now felt, stubbornly and undeniably, like hers, she thought about Garrett. She thought about the woman she'd been, who had believed that what he did was somehow connected to love, who had stayed far past the point of any reason to stay. She thought about the fence rail and the bruise, and the walk through country that should have stopped her, and the man who'd hired her for no good reason, and never once made her feel like she owed him anything.
Yes, she said. Fletcher let out a breath like he'd been holding it since February. Yes, she said again,
and turned to look at him.
But I want to be married under that tree on the north boundary, the one with the 2 big branches. I want to do it in October when the leaves are turning.
Whatever you want, and I want Joseph to stand as witness, of course, and I want to keep the name Ivy.
He smiled.
It was the full, unhurried version of his smile, the one she'd seen maybe 6 times in 8 months, and it made him look 15 years younger.
You can keep whatever you like.
They were married on a Thursday in October, exactly as she'd asked, under the old poplar on the north boundary with the leaves turning gold above them, and Joseph Beaumont standing as witness with his hat in his hands and a rare and genuine smile on his face. The men gave them a new iron cookstove as a wedding gift, the best one available from the supplier in Medicine Hat, and Ivy cried when she saw it in a way she hadn't cried at the ceremony, which was just about right. The winters that followed were winters. The summers were summers. The ranch grew steadily under Fletcher's management and Ivy's careful accounting. She had been telling the truth about her head for numbers, and the discovery that she was better at the ledgers than he was pleased both of them, in ways they found it difficult to explain. The men called her Mrs. Crane, but with a warmth in it that had nothing to do with formality. There were hard years. A drought in the mid-90s that took 1/3 of the cattle and tested everything. A winter that didn't let up until April and nearly didn't let up then. A fire in the east barn from a lantern left burning that could have been worse and wasn't, but only barely. Through all of it, Ivy kept the house. She kept the accounts. She kept the garden, which grew into something remarkable over the years. Tomatoes and beans and root vegetables, and in the sheltered corner against the south wall, a late-season strawberry bed that produced every August without fail. She kept the knowledge, too, of what she'd walked away from and what it had cost and what it was worth to have walked.
Fletcher's hair went fully gray in his 50s. He slowed a little, in his 60s, the way a good horse slows.
Not losing power, just finding a different gear. Joseph retired eventually, and his nephew took over as foreman, a young man who had Joseph's same unhurried competence. Life moved. What didn't move was the particular quality of the evenings, the kitchen lamp, the sound of each other in the house.
The specific weight of knowing someone was there who wanted to be there, not because they had to be, not because they'd run out of other choices, but because they'd chosen it on a Thursday in October and kept choosing it every day after.
When Fletcher was 68, he told Ivy one morning that his chest had been bothering him. She made him see the doctor in medicine hat the same day, over his protests, and sat in the waiting room with her hands in her lap and her face very still, doing the arithmetic she didn't want to do. The news was not the worst news. It was not good news. It was the kind of news that rearranged everything
Quietly and permanently. He lasted 7 years more.
Good years, the most of them.
Slower, yes, and then slower again, and then slower than that. But real years, full years, years where things mattered and were said and were done.
He watched the north boundary change with the seasons from the porch.
He told stories to the Hand's children about the early days of the ranch when the Cypress Hills were wilder and the winters meaner. He sat in the evenings with Ivy and read, or didn't read, and was simply present, which was the thing that mattered most. He died on a spring morning, clear and pale blue, with Ivy's hand in his. Best thing I ever did, he said, near the end, was say yes to the woman on the fence.
You were going to say no, she reminded him. Almost, he said.
Almost.
The grief was enormous and precise, the kind that knows exactly what it is and doesn't try to be anything else. Ivy was 62, and she had learned enough about loss by then to understand that it doesn't diminish what came before it. It is just what follows love always, one way or another.
The debt that makes the having worth it.
They buried Fletcher Crane on the north boundary, near the old poplar, the same tree where they'd been married 30 years before. Joseph's nephew spoke, and Tom Beaumont's nephew came up from Calgary, and the men stood around the grave with their hats off and their faces open in the way men's faces go when they're not trying to be anything in particular. Ivy lived 20 more years after that. She stayed on at Sable Creek, which was hers now, managed by Joseph's nephew and then by his son. She kept the accounts until she was 80, which everyone thought was longer than was necessary and which she found privately amusing. She kept the garden. She taught 2 generations of ranch children to cook and wrote down her aunt's recipes in a proper book rather than letting them live only in her memory. She wrote to her cousin in swift current, the one who had sent her back to Garrett all those years ago. It took her 10 years to write that letter, and it was not a warm letter, but it was an honest one, and they found a kind of peace eventually, which is more than some estrangements manage. She never heard from Garrett Sutcliffe again, and she thought about him less and less as the years went on, which was its own kind of justice. On a morning in late September in the year 1912, Ivy Crane did not come down for breakfast. The girl who helped in the house found her in her bed, her hands folded, her face at rest, the way people look when something has been resolved. They buried her beside Fletcher, under the old poplar, in the gold of the October leaves she had loved. The headstone was simple, her name and her dates, and below them 2 words that Joseph's grandson had suggested after Ivy once said, in passing, that she had been tired most of her life, and then one morning at a north gate in 1891, she had finally stopped. It said, she stayed, and that was exactly right. Because in the end, the whole of it, the walk through the high grass, the fence rail, the bruise she didn't bother hiding, the years of building a life from the ground up in a place that had no reason to keep her, all of it came down to that one thing.
The decision, made once and then remade quietly every day for 30 years, to stop running and stay.
To let a place be hers, to let a person matter, to plant something in difficult ground and trust it to grow. It grew.